Hey everyone, so in this video we're going to talk about functions. What are functions? Functions, if you recall from the introductory video, we basically said that the purpose of programming is to tell a computer what to do. And the way that you do this, the way that you continuously create more and more complex programs is by taking those simple instructions that a computer can follow, combining them, creating your own bigger instructions, and then combining your bigger and bigger instructions to create yet even bigger and more complex instructions. Well, the facility that we use to basically combine a bunch of instructions into a new instruction is called a function. Let me show you a quick example of the syntax that you use in Python to define a function. So you use the def keyword and then you name your function. I'm going to call it big complex instruction. Because you can really think of functions as big complex instructions. They do a bunch of things. They can take inputs and spit out outputs, both of which are optional. So I'm going to have my function take one input and you name your input. So this big complex instruction takes an input. What do we want to call that input? I'm going to say it takes an input and I'm going to call it num, which stands for number. So it takes some number as an input. And then what does it do? Well, it's going to do a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to create a variable a that is that number times itself. And then we're going to add 5 to that. And then we're going to subtract 20 from it. And then we're going to, let's do some more stuff. We're going to multiply it by itself. So basically this is all garbage. It's all pointless stuff, right? But this is proving the point that functions are just big complex instructions. They combine a whole bunch of other instructions and then you name it as a new instruction so then you can quickly reuse that instruction, which we'll see in a second. So let's go ahead and return that. So it takes a number, it does a whole bunch of stuff to that number, and then it returns that new number. So let's go ahead and test that out. And here's how you use so here we defined this big instruction, right? How do you use it? Well, if you recall from an earlier video, I showed you the len operation, which calculates the number of characters in a string. Now it does a little more than that, and this gives you a hint. But I won't get into this because that will require me to explain a whole bunch more. For now, the len operation calculates the number of characters in a string, right? So it's actually a function. This operation is actually a function. So remember, I'm using the word operation, function, member function, and all those words interchangeably because they really are the same thing. The whole point, again, is that you put a whole bunch of information, a whole bunch of data into the computer. You name that data, via variables, and then you operate on them. Now, whether you do it by using the plus or minus symbol, or whether you do it by passing it into functions, it doesn't matter. You're operating on them somehow. So I like the word operations. So the len function, you call it by passing in basically your string like this, right? And let's go ahead and assign it to a variable. So this is the syntax that we use for calling, or in other words, using. Basically calling a function means using that function. We want to differentiate between calling or using and defining, right? Here we defined it. We said what this function will do when it's called. We said that when this function is called, it takes a number, first of all, so it has to be called with a number, and then it does a whole bunch of stuff, and then it returns that number. And here we're actually using a function, and in a brief period of time, we'll go ahead and use this one too. But for now, we'll use the built-in function len. There we go, 5 characters in hello, which I'm pretty sure is true. Okay, so let's use our own function. It's the same exact syntax. We'll assign the return to be big complex instruction, and inside parentheses we're going to pass the actual argument. So I should mention quickly a quick note about terminology. So this input that our function takes, when you're thinking about it from the perspective of the function, so when you're defining the function, you call it a parameter. But when you're using the function, then whatever you pass in, you call it the argument. So one way to think of it is actually, I don't want to get any more into this because it's going to get more complex. It's just terminology, but it's still just inputs going into our functions. That's the best way to think about it right now. So let's go ahead and pass in an argument. We'll say, okay, we'll pass in 3, and let's see what happened to 3. Okay, so when you pass in 3 and you do all of this stuff to it, you end up getting 36. Okay, so I showed you this big useless function. It is useless because it does a whole bunch of random stuff to its input and then returns it. But it does show that really functions are just big complex instructions. It's a way to group a whole bunch of instructions and name it, and then be able to quickly use it over and over again. Let's actually make a useful function. So we're going to make a function that calculates the absolute value of a number. Recall that the absolute value of a number is just how far away it is from 0. So the absolute value of 3 is obviously 3, but so is the absolute value of -3. Basically, the way that you can do this is, if the value is negative, just multiply it by -1 to make it positive. That'll always work. So let's express that in code. Let's create that function. We'll use the def keyword to define the function. We'll call it absolute. It's going to take a number. And what is it going to do? So if that number is less than 0, in other words, if it's negative, we're going to return -1 times that number. So if it's -3, for example, -1 times -3 is 3, which is the correct answer. The absolute value of -3 is 3. Otherwise, we're just going to return that number itself. So the way that the flow of control, the way that it would work is, you start at this line, right? If the number is less than 0, so if it is negative, we return, meaning we get out of this function this value. Otherwise, this never gets executed. So if the number is greater than 0, in other words, it's positive, this will never get executed. Because remember, as we covered in the previous tutorial, the statements underneath an if statement only get executed if its condition is true. Otherwise, you skip to the next one that's not underneath the if statement. Okay, so we've defined that function. Now let's use it. Let's assign it to some variable c. We'll use our function on -3. What do we get? 3. And here's the beauty of functions. Now that I've defined this big complex instruction called absolute, which calculates the absolute value, I can quickly reuse it, right? I can say d is equal, what if I want to find out the absolute value of -14? Well, that's 14. What if I want to find out the absolute value of 5? Well, that's going to be 5. So you see, this is really the beauty of functions. Once you define them, right, then you can keep on using them again and again, and you'll get slightly different behavior because you keep on passing in different inputs to the function. So quick recap. Functions are how you combine basic instructions that the computer already knows how to follow into bigger, more complex instructions. And the beauty of it is that you can now use that big complex instruction over and over again, passing in different arguments to make it do slightly different behaviors. That's it for this tutorial. I think the next few tutorials are going to be very, very fun, because now we're getting into the real, true heart of programming. Functions is the start of that, because now we're beginning to kind of play with Legos. We're creating bigger and bigger things. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to really use this facility. So I hope to see you there. Bye-bye.